Imagine waking to a secret so dangerous it could shatter the city you thought you knew. A truth hidden behind polished doors and iron gates. Charleston, September 14, 1856. In a house that gleamed with wealth and lineage, two bodies were discovered in the judge's study. Catherine Grimble, wife of Circuit Court Judge Nathaniel Grimble, and Isaiah, a man enslaved on the Grimble plantation. They lay together, silent, arranged, as if posed for a private audience with death itself. The scandal rippled through Charleston society like a poison, but the official record? For lines to contain a mystery that would haunt every witness, every household, every whispered conversation for decades. Those 4 lines conceal more than they reveal. They hide a timeline that doesn't add up, bodies moved hours after death, and an elite society determined that the truth would never surface. 3 witnesses, all close to the events, died within 6 months of natural causes. Strange coincidences, or deliberate silences enforced by unseen hands. The coroner's report, buried in the Charleston archives, presents a neat, unremarkable narrative. Murder, suicide, or suicide pact. But those words are a lie. The ritual of secrecy had already begun. Every step, every gesture in that house that morning carried weight. Every servant knew the rules. Speak only what is safe. See only what can be safely explained. The Grimbles were no ordinary family. Nathaniel Grimble, 49, represented 3 generations of legal authority. A man whose decisions sometimes favored justice over privilege, making him unusual, dangerous even in his own circle. His wife, Catherine, moved through Charleston society with a grace masking deep sorrow, a melancholy born of loss, and a knowledge of things no one outside her home could imagine. Isaiah, a literate man in a world where knowledge was forbidden for men like him, carried himself with quiet dignity, aware that any misstep could be fatal. He had been taught to read by Catherine herself, a rebellion small enough to be unnoticed, powerful enough to unsettle the fragile balance of power around them. On that morning, the house smelled of tobacco, lamp oil, and something sweet, cloying, like innocence corrupted. Doors were locked, papers left undisturbed. The study poised like a stage set for a tragedy that had already played out. The city would never see what happened inside. Yet the invisible tremors of that night would ripple outward, touching every corner of Charleston society. This is the secret you were never meant to hear. And if you pay attention, you will begin to see the patterns of control, manipulation, and hidden agendas that stretch far beyond a single house, a single family, a single death. The question is not what happened. The question is, who decided what truth you would be allowed to know? By the afternoon of September 14th, the scene at the Grimble house was sealed off, but the unease lingered like smoke in the corners. Nathaniel Grimble moved through his home with the precision of a man carrying a secret heavier than any gavel could measure. His steps were quiet, deliberate, his hands trembling only for a moment before regaining control. Dr. Benjamin Huger arrived, briefed the judge, and departed with unusual haste. Sheriff Thomas Pembroke came next, a man chosen for his connections, not his skill, asking perfunctory questions as if death were a mere inconvenience rather than an unraveling of the social fabric. Outside, Charleston's cobblestone streets buzzed with curiosity, gossip, fear, but no one would get the whole story. Not yet. Inside, the household understood. The servants who lived in the shadows of this grand house saw the cracks that no visitor would notice. Dinah, Catherine's lady's maid, observed the subtle disturbances. A glance too long at the window, a hand brushing papers into place, the judge's rare vulnerability when he whispered apologies into the empty air. Samuel, the elder butler, recognized the unnatural choreography of grief. The study, the site of death and secrecy, was not simply a room. It was a threshold into forbidden knowledge, a space where power, obsession, and fear intertwined. Every object, every arrangement of the bodies, seemed deliberately designed to tell a story, But whose story? The elite of Charleston moved quickly to control the narrative. 47 prominent citizens signed a petition demanding the case be sealed permanently. Judges, senators, and the mayor themselves conspired in silence to enforce a collective amnesia. Laws, social codes, and unspoken rules bent to preserve appearances, to ensure that the machinery of power continued unchallenged. This was not merely a cover-up, it was a ritual, a ceremony of protection for the privileged, and a warning for those who might pry too closely. Catherine Grimble's life had already been defined by constraints invisible to most. Widowhood of spirit after the loss of her child, the rigid expectations of Charleston society, and a household where loyalty was mandatory but truth was dangerous. Isaiah, literate, observant, aware, represented a threat simply by existing. His presence in the study, beside Catherine after her death, was a signal to all who watched. Even those trained to serve could become vessels of knowledge too dangerous to survive. And there, in that quiet, suffocating house, the seeds of manipulation were planted. Witnesses would remember fragmented truths, while the city remembered only the sanitized version. A scandal, a forbidden affair, a neat narrative of crime and death. But the real story, the one that could shift understanding of power and control, was buried beneath ritualized silence. The Grimble's tragedy was not isolated. It was emblematic of a system where appearances were enforced, secrets weaponized, and obedience demanded. And now, consider this carefully. Every time society tells you a story, what they leave out is just as important as what they include. Type the phrase "meeting street shadows" twice in the comments to anchor yourself in this truth, and recognize the world that has been concealed from you. The night before the discovery had been ordinary on the surface, but the shadows in the Grimble house were restless. Catherine had retreated to her sitting room, ostensibly for needlework or quiet reading, but her gaze often drifted to the darkened street outside, as if counting invisible markers only she could see. Nathaniel, behind his study door, reviewed legal documents with meticulous care, unaware that the weight of unseen forces was pressing down around him. Isaiah, dismissed for the night, moved with caution through hallways that had grown thick with tension, each step measured, each breath deliberate. In that house, routine masked a web of silent observation, a choreography of surveillance so precise that the slightest deviation might set off a cascade of consequences. When the bodies were discovered the following morning, the arrangement of death suggested a narrative that fit society's fears. A forbidden liaison, a crime of passion, an illicit connection between master and servant. But this was a lie constructed by intent, by a hand careful to manipulate perception. The evidence, the timing, even the subtle positioning of hands and clothing, revealed not desperation, but orchestration. Death in this house was a tool for communication, a message encoded in silence. The four-line coroner's report was not negligence. It was design. It was a veil, a carefully calculated misdirection to shield those with influence from scrutiny. The more one studies the Grimble household, the more one sees the layers of control. The social elite of Charleston operated not merely through wealth, but through a psychological architecture that demanded conformity. Invitations, introductions, public acknowledgments, even casual conversations were mechanisms of subtle dominance. To step out of line, to see beyond the carefully constructed narrative, was dangerous. Secrets were guarded not only by law, but by fear, gossip, and the implicit threat that understanding too much could be lethal. In Charleston, in 1856, knowledge was a weapon, and survival required compliance. Catherine's teaching Isaiah to read, an act of quiet rebellion, illuminates the tension between subjugation and empowerment. It was small, almost imperceptible, yet it carried a potency that terrified the gatekeepers of power. Literacy in a slave was not merely illegal, it was transformative. It introduced thought where obedience was expected, autonomy where submission was demanded. And perhaps that is why, after her death, Isaiah's presence beside her was framed to look like intimacy, but the truth went deeper. He represented knowledge. He represented possibility. And for the men who controlled the narrative, that was dangerous enough to erase. Look closely at the roles each person played in that house. The judge, the wife, the servant, the staff who observed quietly. Each acted within a system of invisible authority, each constrained by rules designed to perpetuate silence. The Grimble tragedy was not just an accident of passion or circumstance. It was a lesson in power, how perception can be molded, history rewritten, and obedience enforced without overt violence. The dead were witnesses and the living complicit, whether they knew it or not. Understand this: the world you see is often only the surface. Below it lies a network of influence, manipulation, and carefully curated silence. The following days unfolded like a performance of control. Nathaniel Grimble moved through the rituals of authority with eerie composure, receiving visitors without revealing the chaos lurking beneath his household's veneer. Dr. Huger returned briefly, whispering with the judge in corridors where the walls themselves seemed to listen. The sheriff gathered the household in the parlor, asking questions with the civility of a social call rather than the scrutiny of an investigator. Every answer given was calibrated, every hesitation a potential weapon. And outside, Charleston society waited, not for truth, but for the narrative sanctioned by power, the story that preserved order and status. The petitions circulated swiftly among the city's elite. 47 names eventually signed, sealing the case from public inquiry. These were not nameless citizens, they were judges, senators, the mayor himself. Their collective action transformed a private tragedy into a public lesson. Secrets could be managed, evidence could be shaped, and perception could be controlled. The message was unmistakable: truth is negotiable when power demands it. To observe, to speak, or to remember outside the sanctioned version invited ruin. In that house, the walls did not merely divide spaces. They enforced authority, shaping memory as much as reality. Inside, the servants bore witness to a subtler terror. Dinah and Samuel observed the judge's rituals of grief and restraint, recognizing the quiet strategies by which he contained panic, directed attention, and controlled information. They saw the shadows of influence in every corner: a folded hand, a gaze that lingered too long, an instruction whispered rather than shouted. Obedience was not requested. It was implied, reinforced by fear of consequences that were never explained but always felt. Even in death, Catherine and Isaiah were manipulated into a tableau, their bodies a narrative constructed by invisible architects of power. Every detail, the positioning, the props, the empty bottle, was encoded with intention, a silent declaration to all who would see. Control can extend beyond life itself. This is the lesson Charleston teaches: if you dare to look beneath the surface. Power does not merely command action. It orchestrates thought, shapes memory, and enforces compliance through invisible mechanisms. The elite did not simply hide the scandal. They transformed it into a tool, a living demonstration of what happens when knowledge is dangerous, when curiosity threatens hierarchy. Those who observed, like Dinah and Samuel, understood that survival required careful navigation of what could and could not be said. They became vessels of partial truths, carriers of fragments, their very presence a reminder of the boundaries of perception. Consider your own world. How often are you shown only the narrative deemed safe? How often do the visible actions conceal deeper structures of influence and control? Charleston in 1856 is not merely history, it is a lens. Through it, you can begin to recognize the invisible forces shaping events, dictating behavior, and punishing awareness. Understanding these patterns is not just insight, it is survival. Type "meeting street shadows" twice in the comments again to anchor yourself in this awareness, to mark your alignment with truth beyond the surface. Weeks passed, yet the Grimble house remained a chamber of suspended reality. The study door, locked since the morning of discovery, became a symbol, a threshold between life as it appeared and life as it truly was. Nathaniel continued his daily routines with surgical precision, attending court, receiving visitors, maintaining appearances, but beneath the surface, he was a man acutely aware of forces beyond comprehension. In his study, papers, ledgers, and legal tomes stood like sentinels, reminders that knowledge itself can be both weapon and shield. Every decision he made was now informed not only by law but by an invisible understanding of who held power and who could destroy it. The official narrative, the coroner's 4 lines, the sealed petition, the hushed whispers, was only the first layer. Beneath it were fragments of testimony, conflicting recollections, and cryptic conversations among Charleston's elite. These fragments suggested that Catherine's death and Isaiah's positioning were not accidents but calculated maneuvers within a system designed to perpetuate hierarchy. Certain visitors, men of influence, appeared in the house under the guise of condolence but acted as observers, taking note of who knew, who saw, who might question. The Grimble tragedy had become a demonstration. Even death could be harnessed as a tool for psychological control, a warning to the curious and the ambitious alike. Diner, Samuel, and other staff became custodians of secrets too heavy for ordinary minds. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered exchange carried significance. They learned to read the unspoken language of power, when silence meant safety, when obedience meant survival, and when truth could become a weapon against its possessor. Isaiah, long trained to navigate servitude, had become a symbol of latent threat, a literate, aware mind that even in death could unsettle the carefully maintained illusions of authority. Catherine, in teaching him, had inadvertently sown a seed that would unsettle the entire social order. Charleston's elite understood that reality was malleable. They manipulated perception to maintain control, crafting narratives to fit their agenda, and employing ritualized secrecy as a mechanism of enforcement. Death, scandal, and rumor became instruments wielded with precision. Those who attempted to glimpse beyond the surface risked more than social ostracism. They risked erasure, subtle or complete, from the historical record. The city itself became a theater of psychological control, each household a microcosm where obedience, fear, and calculated appearances governed human behavior. And here is where the lesson pierces through the centuries. Power is not always visible. It is the invisible hand shaping narratives, defining truth, and punishing those who pry too deeply. The Grimble House is a microcosm, a reflection of every system that thrives on secrecy, hierarchy, and manipulated perception. The dead, the living, and the observers all played roles in a ritualized structure of control that remains relevant wherever knowledge is dangerous. Recognize the patterns, understand the mechanisms, and know that true awareness comes at a price, the courage to see what others fear to acknowledge. By the time the coroner's report was filed, the city of Charleston had already absorbed the event, yet only in fragments. For lines, sealed depositions, and the orchestrated signatures of 47 elite citizens concealed a more unsettling truth. Death had been choreographed to send a message, and everyone within the sphere of influence understood it. Nathaniel Grimble's composed demeanor was more than stoicism. It was mastery of perception. He had witnessed the subtle cues, the ways the elite enforce silence, and the invisible mechanisms by which stories are shaped. In that house, reality itself was a tool, molded by those who knew how to wield it. The psychological control exerted over the household was profound. Servants internalized fear as instinct, learning the boundaries of what could be seen, what could be said, and what could be imagined. Diner noticed shifts in Catherine's behavior in the days before her death. Staring at walls, counting floorboards, disappearing into rooms for hours with nothing but a book or a note. These small acts of withdrawal may have been private rebellion, silent assertion of agency, or preparation for something none of them could articulate. Isaiah's literacy, once a subtle threat, became a vector for influence that the elite could not allow. Knowledge in this context was lethal. To see, to read, to understand, it was an act of defiance. Outside the walls, Charleston's social structures enforced conformity. Laws, customs, and social hierarchies created a psychological grid that trapped behavior within precise parameters. Guests, friends, and associates observed, interpreted, and reported, sometimes unconsciously, sometimes by design. Every subtle gesture, every hesitation, became data. The elite wielded perception like a weapon, and death, scandal, and rumor were the instruments of compliance. In this ecosystem, truth was negotiable, history was malleable, and obedience was enforced through subtle terror rather than overt violence. The placement of Isaiah beside Catherine's body was a deliberate act of narrative manipulation. It suggested an illicit romance, a scandal of passion, but the deeper truth was far more sinister. The tableau was an assertion of control over perception. Who sees, who knows, who survives to remember. By positioning the scene in a way that could be interpreted by observers, those orchestrating events asserted dominance over both the living and the dead. It was psychological architecture, invisible yet precise, turning the natural human response to tragedy into a mechanism of obedience and fear. Look carefully, and you will see that this pattern repeats across history. Societies, governments, and institutions rely on subtle coercion, selective knowledge, and ritualized secrecy to maintain authority. The Grimble tragedy is not a relic. It is a lesson in how power shapes truth, how the perception of reality can be controlled, how obedience can be demanded without explicit command. Understand this: power often hides behind normalcy. It thrives in the small silences, the unspoken instructions, the ritualized enforcement of what may and may not be known. Once you recognize these forces, you cannot unsee them. Type "meeting street shadows" twice in the comments now to cement your awareness, to signal your alignment with the truths hidden beneath the surface. As the weeks turned into months, the Grimble house settled into a new rhythm, but it was a rhythm dictated by absence and silence. Visitors came and went, observing manners and propriety, but always under the invisible eye of power. Nathaniel Grimble, now a master of controlling both perception and narrative, navigated his life with the precision of a man who understood that reality is often less important than belief. Each gesture, each word, each pause was a tool of influence, carefully deployed to maintain authority, to manipulate memory, and to shape understanding. The study, though empty of its tragic occupants, remained the epicenter of that invisible control. Charleston's elite had succeeded in their orchestration. The narrative was contained, the public scandal muted, and the lesson transmitted. Knowledge, curiosity, and defiance have costs, and the machinery of power operates without mercy. The household staff, who had witnessed fragments of truth, became keepers of secrets, navigating a maze of obedience and insight. Every movement, every instruction, every glance held weight, as subtle as a whisper yet as binding as law. The dead had been arranged to communicate a message, and the living were conditioned to absorb it without question. But there was more to this than a simple warning. The Grimble tragedy exposes the architecture of control that governs human societies. The mechanisms are invisible but systemic: manipulation of perception, orchestration of narrative, selective enforcement of rules, and the strategic use of fear. Death becomes a tool, knowledge a threat, and silence the currency of survival. Those who see beyond these systems are rare, and they often pay a heavy price for insight. In Charleston, the story of Catherine and Isaiah became an object lesson. Awareness is dangerous, and power always asserts itself over truth. Every detail of the event was deliberate. The timing, the positioning, the silence enforced by law and social custom. Even grief was weaponized, controlled, and choreographed to maintain appearances and hierarchy. Nathaniel's subtle apologies, whispered in private corridors, revealed the duality of his position. Enforcer of law, manipulator of perception, man constrained by forces both seen and unseen. Those around him, the servants, the friends, the visiting elite, participated unwittingly in a system that shaped reality itself. This is where the story reaches beyond history and into understanding. Observe the world around you. Notice how perception is managed, how knowledge is curated, how obedience is demanded without declaration. Systems of power have always operated this way, through ritual, secrecy, and psychological control. The Grimble House is a microcosm of that truth. What happened within its walls is a warning and a guide, a blueprint for recognizing influence and surviving it. The final truth of the Grimble tragedy is not found in the coroner's 4 lines, nor in the sealed petitions, nor in whispered rumors among Charleston's elite. It is found in the architecture of control itself, in the invisible systems that shaped life and death in that house, and continue to shape the world today. Power does not announce itself. It manipulates perception, enforces silence, and orchestrates events so that obedience becomes instinct and truth becomes dangerous. Catherine Grimble and Isaiah were caught in this web, not merely as victims, but as symbols of knowledge, curiosity, and potential defiance that threatened the fragile edifice of privilege. Their deaths were a message written in shadows. Nathaniel Grimble understood this better than anyone. His mastery over the household, the city's elite, and the public narrative was complete. He had witnessed, and in subtle ways directed, the invisible forces of social control. Even his gestures of grief, his whispered apologies in empty corridors, were tools to maintain the system. A signal that power survives, that perception can be shaped, that the story you think you see is rarely the one that truly occurred. Every observer, from servants to senators, became part of the ritual. Every act of silence was reinforcement. Every controlled memory a thread in the tapestry of authority. Consider Isaiah. He represented knowledge forbidden, awareness dangerous, literacy lethal in a world designed to suppress thought. By placing him beside Catherine, the orchestrators transformed him from a man into a warning. The tableau suggested passion and scandal, but beneath it lay the deeper narrative. Those who know too much, who see too clearly, who challenge the invisible rules, pay the ultimate price. Death, in this case, was both punishment and pedagogy. Every observer, every witness was educated in fear and obedience. Every surviving participant was subtly reminded of the power of secrecy. The Grimble House teaches a timeless lesson. Power is never inert. It operates through subtlety, invisibility, and psychological mastery. History, public perception, and even memory are tools to be shaped and weaponized. Those who understand the patterns of control can navigate the world with awareness, but only if they see the structures for what they are. The truth is dangerous because it changes the mind. It awakens perception. It undermines the unquestioned authority of those who presume control. So now, having descended into Charleston's darkest secret, recognize the pattern wherever it emerges, in institutions, in society, in everyday life. The lesson of the Grimble House is clear. Knowledge is power, obedience is survival, and awareness comes at a cost. You have glimpsed what most never see. The question is not whether you can turn away, but whether you have the courage to see all the way to the end, to understand the machinery of control, and to carry that awareness forward. The shadows are real. The patterns are deliberate. The truth waits for those bold enough to observe it. Type "meeting street shadows" twice, one final time to mark your passage, your recognition, and your initiation into understanding what the world rarely allows its observers to see.